She was 19 years old the autumn she stood at the edge of a rusted railroad siding with everything she owned wrapped in a single flour sack bundle. And she had $11 to her name. 2 years before, at 17, her uncle Corwin Ashby had put her out of the only house she had ever known, telling the whole of Larkspur Junction that she was a burden he could no longer carry. Though the truth was simpler and colder, he had already sold what little her late father left her, and did not care to feed the girl who might one day ask where the money went. She had $11, a needle and thread, and a memory of her father's voice explaining how a train finds its way home, even in the dark. With 9 of those dollars, she bought a derelict railroad car, sun-bleached and half-swallowed by prairie grass, sitting forgotten on an abandoned spur behind the depot, a car nobody wanted, sold to her by a tired station master who only wanted it gone. It was, by any sensible measure, a foolish purchase. A shell of splintered wood and rust that could not shelter a person from a hard rain, let alone build a life, but sealed above her head, behind a false ceiling that no one had opened in 15 years, was a promise that would not only save her, it would return to an entire forgotten corner of that town, something that had been stolen from them so long ago, most had stopped believing it was owed at all. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Della Mercer. If you have ever felt like the whole town wrote you off, like the value in you was hiding somewhere no one thought to look, stay with us. And don't forget to follow this channel so you never miss where a story like hers leads. Della Mercer had been born in the spring of 1874 in a clapboard house within sight of the Larkspur Junction depot, close enough that she fell asleep most nights to the low moan of the evening freight rolling through, and close enough that her father, Thomas Mercer, could walk to his post as assistant station master in 11 minutes flat, which he timed, because Thomas Mercer timed everything. He was a precise man, not a cold one, the kind of precision that came from respect rather than rigidity. The belief that a schedule kept honestly was a kind of promise kept to strangers you would never meet. He taught Della to read a timetable before she could read a storybook, taught her to balance a ledger with a pencil sharpened to a fine point, taught her that a column of numbers was a kind of truth-telling, that a man's character showed in whether his books matched his word. Her mother, Ruth, had died of a fever when Della was 6, and so it was Thomas who raised her, who let her ride along in the cab of the switch engine on slow Sunday mornings, who let her memorize the names of every man on the section crew, the Irish Gandhi dancers, the Chinese laborers who had laid track through the granite passes further west before drifting east looking for steadier work, the black freedmen who ran the roundhouse and kept the boilers alive through winter nights that could freeze a man's breath before it left his mouth. Her father did not believe, as many did, that some hands were worth less than others for the same labor, and he said so plainly, which did not make him popular with the railroad's owners, but made him beloved by the men who built and mended the line with their backs. Della absorbed all of this the way a child absorbs the weather of a household, not as lessons, but as the shape of the world. She learned to sew from a woman named Ah Lin, wife of a track foreman, who taught her patient, invisible stitches, the kind that hold a seam together for years without ever showing themselves, and Della would later think that this, too, was something her father would have approved of, work that mattered most when no one noticed it had been done. By the time she was 15, she could keep a household ledger better than most grown men, mend a coat so the tear vanished entirely, and recite from memory the schedule of every train that passed through Larkspur Junction on its way to the Kansas grain towns and beyond. She believed, because her father had shown her nothing else to believe, that patience and honest work were owed their due eventually, even if the world was slow and clumsy about paying it. She did not yet know how long, and how unfairly, a person could be made to wait. The winter Della turned 17, Her father caught a chill inspecting a washed-out trestle in a sleeting rain, and the chill became a fever, and the fever took him in 11 days, fast enough that Della barely had time to understand what was happening before she was standing at a graveside in a borrowed black dress, watching the frozen dirt fall onto the coffin of the only parent she had left. Her father's affairs passed, by law and by the tangled logic of guardianship in those years, into the hands of his late wife's brother, Corwin Ashby, a hog buyer with soft hands and a harder heart, who arrived from 2 counties over within the week, ostensibly to see to Della's welfare. Within a month he had sold the clapboard house, claiming debts that Della never saw documented, though she remembered her father's ledgers being scrupulously, almost stubbornly clean. Within 2 months, he had liquidated her father's modest savings, a sum meant to see her through until she could marry or find respectable work, and folded it quietly into his own accounts. Della, 17 and grieving, and without a single relative willing to contradict a grown man's version of events, watched her inheritance disappear the way frost disappears off a window, slow enough that you can almost convince yourself it isn't happening, and then all at once it is simply gone. When she finally gathered the courage to ask him directly where her father's money had gone, Corwin Ashby told her, without any particular cruelty in his voice, which was somehow worse than cruelty would have been, that a girl her age ought to be grateful for a roof at all, and that the roof would no longer be hers past the first of the month. He gave her $4, called it generous, and put her on the road with a single bag. She was 17 years old, and she had nowhere to go. And this, the town would later understand, once the truth of the ledgers came out about Corwin Ashby's other dealings, was not the first time he had made a young dependent's misfortune serve his own comfort. Only the first time anyone in Larkspur Junction had cared enough to notice. For 2 years, Della survived on the outskirts of respectability, the way many women without family or fortune did in those days. She took in mending. She did laundry for the boarding house on Cedar Street. She swept the general store before dawn for a few coins a week. And she slept in a narrow rented room above the harness shop that smelled permanently of leather and lamp oil. She was careful with every cent, the way her father had taught her to be careful with numbers, and slowly, humiliatingly slowly, she built a small hoard, hidden in a tin behind a loose board, dollar by dollar, quarter by quarter, until by the autumn she turned 19, she had $11, and a plan that amounted to little more than a wish, that somewhere, somehow, there might be a way to stop renting her life from other people and start owning some small corner of it herself. Larkspur Junction, like 100 towns along that stretch of rail, had gone through hard years after the Panic of 1893, nearly a decade before, when half the Western lines went bankrupt overnight and left towns full of unpaid workers and broken promises in their wake. The old spur behind the depot, once used to store surplus rolling stock during the boom years, had become a kind of graveyard for rail cars nobody claimed, including one particular boxcar turned caboose, squat and rust-streaked, its wheels sunk into the weeds, that had sat abandoned so long that even the station master, a tired, kind man named Otis Pruitt, who had known Della's father, could no longer say who it technically belonged to. When Della asked him about it, half in jest, he told her that for $9 and a promise to haul it off the company's books before the spring inspection, it was hers, false ceiling, broken stove, and all. She thought of it as a roof, nothing more, a place she could not be evicted from, because no one else wanted it, and she paid him that very afternoon, feeling both reckless and, for the first time in 2 years, entirely her own person. The car did not look like much of anything the first morning she let herself inside it with a borrowed crowbar and a lantern. Years of dust lay thick as felt across the floorboards. The stove was choked with rust, and a family of field mice had clearly considered the place their own for some time. But Della had been raised by a man who believed that anything neglected could still be honest underneath its neglect, and so she began, that first week, the slow work of reclaiming it, scrubbing the floor on her knees, prying loose the rotted trim, patching what could be patched with materials scavenged from other abandoned cars on the spur. It was on the third day, while standing on an overturned crate to examine a water stain along the ceiling boards near the rear of the car, that she noticed something odd. A seam in the wood that did not match the honest, weathered grain around it. A section of ceiling paneling that had clearly been cut and refitted by a careful hand rather than worn down by time. Her father's training rose in her, without her even summoning it. A discrepancy. A place where the numbers didn't match the story they were supposed to tell. And she worked her fingers along the seam until she found where a narrow panel had been set into a shallow cavity between the roof ribs and disguised with the same weathered stain as the boards around it. When she finally pried it loose, dust sifted down into her upturned face, and inside the narrow space she found not treasure, not gold, but something that made her heart beat harder all the same. A small tin box, rusted shut and tucked beside it, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle with age. A single carved wooden token, stamped with a number and the initials of the Larkspur and Western Rail Company. The kind of token, she would later learn, that had once been issued to laborers in place of wages during the company's final desperate months, redeemable for pay that, for most of the men who carried them, had never come. It took Della 3 days to work the rusted tin open without destroying whatever lay inside, and when she finally did, working carefully with vinegar and a thin blade by lamplight, what she found inside changed the shape of everything. There was a leather-bound ledger, water-stained but legible, and a bundle of letters tied with twine gone the color of weak tea, and beneath them, folded in oilcloth of its own, a legal document bearing a notary's seal and the signature of a man named Ezra Vane, who had been, Della came to understand from the letters, the founder and principal owner of the Larkspur and Western Rail Company before its collapse in the panic. The ledger, written in a careful, almost apologetic hand, recorded wages owed, not paid, owed, to some 63 laborers by name, Irish and Chinese, and black workers among them. Men who had graded the roadbed and laid the track and kept the line running through its final desperate seasons on promises that the company, and later Ezra Vane personally, had never made good on. The letters, addressed to no one in particular, read like a confession a dying man writes when he cannot bring himself to speak it aloud to the people he has wronged. Ezra Vane had known, even as the company failed around him, that he could not pay the debt in cash, and so in the last months before the receivers came, he had quietly set aside a parcel of company land along the western edge of town, good bottomland near the creek. Land the railroad no longer needed for track, but that a struggling company town badly needed for homes and gardens, and had a lawyer draw up a trust deed transferring that land into the names of the very workers his company owed, to be held for them and their heirs. But before the deed could be recorded and made public, Ezra Vane had died of a sudden apoplexy, and his son, Cornelius Vane, barely 25 at the time, and eager to salvage what remained of the family's standing, had quietly suppressed the unrecorded deed, told the workers and the town that the company's debts had died with the company, and rebuilt the Vane family's fortune on land that was never rightfully his to keep. The tin box, the ledger, the letters, the deed, all of it had been hidden by someone. Della realized as she read further, someone close enough to Ezra Vane to know his conscience, and brave enough to try to preserve the truth even after he could no longer act on it himself. Sealed into the ceiling of a railcar bound for a scrapyard where, perhaps, it was meant to be found only by accident, only by someone with nothing left to lose, and every reason to look closely at things other people had stopped seeing. The town of Larkspur Junction, Della soon learned as she asked careful, quiet questions of Otis Pruitt and old Ah Lin, who was still alive and sharp-eyed at 70, still remembered those years with a clarity that made Della's chest ache. The workers named in that ledger, or their widows and children, had mostly stayed on in Larkspur Junction, settled into a low, marshy stretch of ground on the town's eastern edge that everyone simply called the Flats, land nobody else had wanted, land that flooded every spring and where the wells ran brackish. Because it was the only land available to families the rest of the town had quietly decided did not deserve better. Cornelius Vane, meanwhile, had become the most powerful man in the county, owner of the bank, principal shareholder in the new grain elevator, a man whose name graced the cornerstone of the courthouse, and whose word carried more weight in Larkspur Junction than the county judges. He was, by every outward measure, respectable, generous even, known to donate to the church roof fund and the schoolhouse library, and it was this respectability, Della understood with a cold, sinking clarity, that made the truth in that tin box so dangerous to speak aloud. She was a 19-year-old woman with no family standing, no money beyond what she'd spent on a railcar, and no proof beyond a water-stained ledger and a dead man's letters, asking the town to believe that its most trusted citizen had built his fortune on a lie 40 years old. And yet she could not put the tin box back in the ceiling and pretend she had never opened it, not when she had grown up watching her father balance a column of figures with the quiet insistence that every number told the truth about someone, whether that someone wanted it told or not. It did not take long for word to travel that the Mercer girl had bought the old railcar on the spur and was asking peculiar questions about wages and old company records, and it took even less time for those questions to reach Cornelius Vane himself. He came to her one gray afternoon in his good coat, driven by his own carriage rather than sending a clerk, which told Della plainly how seriously he took the matter even as his manner remained smooth and almost kindly. He offered, first, to buy the rail car from her outright for $25, a sum meant to seem generous to a poor seamstress, and that he clearly expected would end the matter. When Della, politely but without flinching, declined, his tone cooled by degrees, and he suggested that whatever old papers she believed she'd found were almost certainly worthless, forgeries perhaps, or the ravings of a company that had gone bankrupt and vindictive in its final days, and that a young woman of her circumstances would do well not to make enemies of the people capable of ruining what little reputation she had left. He reminded her, not quite as a threat but close enough to one, that the ground her railcar sat on belonged, technically, to the bank now, following the old railroad's dissolution, and that arrangements such as Otis Pruitt's informal sale could easily be undone if the bank chose to take an interest in enforcing its paperwork. He left without raising his voice even once, and Della understood, watching his carriage roll away down the muddy street, that she was now in a fight with a man who owned the bank, the newspaper's largest advertiser, and very likely the patience of most of the town, and that she had, on her side, only a rusted tin box, a dead man's guilty conscience, and whatever nerve she had left. She did not fight him alone. In the end, though it took her the better part of 2 anxious weeks to understand that she didn't have to. She went first to old Ah Lin, whose husband's name appeared plainly in Ezra Vane's ledger among the unpaid, and watched the old woman's hands tremble not with fear, but with something closer to vindication, as she read her late husband's name in that careful, guilty script. Ah Lin, in turn, brought her to the Flats, to a gathering in the small chapel the community had built themselves from salvaged lumber, where Della read the ledger aloud by lamplight to a room of some 40 people, sons and daughters and widows of the men who had built the very rails the trains still rolled on every day, and watched decades of quiet, swallowed grievance rise in that room like heat off a stove. It was there, among people who had every reason to distrust a stranger showing up with old papers and a stranger's face, that Della found her surest allies, not because she was owed their trust, but because she had brought them, unasked, the one thing no one else in 40 years had bothered to bring, an honest accounting. Among them was a young lawyer's clerk named Hosea Bell, grandson of one of the men listed in the ledger, who had scraped together enough education to read the law even if he could not yet afford to practice it freely. And it was Hosea who explained to Della that an unrecorded but properly executed and witnessed deed, if its authenticity could be established, still carried weight in a court of law even decades later, provided they could prove it had genuinely been signed and sealed by Ezra Vane before his death and not tampered with since. The letters, addressed in Ezra Vane's own confessional hand and matching, Hosea confirmed after comparing them to old company correspondence at the courthouse. The elder Vane's known signature became the thread that could, if pulled carefully and publicly enough, unravel 40 years of quiet theft dressed up as inheritance. The reckoning, when it finally came, did not happen in a courtroom, though a courtroom eventually made it official. It happened first at a town meeting called, ironically, by Cornelius Vane himself to discuss funding for a new grain elevator expansion, a meeting he expected to preside over, as he always did, with easy authority and universal deference. Della stood at the back of the packed hall through most of the proceedings, the tin box heavy against her side, and when Vane called at last for any other business before adjournment, thinking the evening safely his own, she walked to the front of the room with Hosea Bell and old Alin beside her, and asked, in a voice she willed steady though her hands were not, whether the town would like to hear what had been sealed in the ceiling of an abandoned railcar for the better part of 40 years. She read the ledger aloud, name by name, wage by unpaid wage, and she read the letters, Ezra Vane's own guilty words admitting what his company owed and to whom, and she held up the trust deed, its notary seal still legible, transferring land along the creek, land everyone in that hall knew as the good, dry bottomland the bank had fenced off years before, calling it a company reserve. Land that in truth had been meant for the very families still living in the flood-prone misery of the flats. Cornelius Vane's protests that the papers were forgeries, that a chit of a seamstress was slandering a respected family, grew thinner with every name Della read aloud, because half the room recognized those names as their neighbors, their own kin, and the other half recognized, with the particular shame of people realizing they had comfortably not asked questions for 40 years, that the story fit every rumor and half-explained fact they had quietly filed away and never examined. It was Otis Pruitt, of all people, who stood and said plainly that he remembered the elder Vane, in his last months, speaking of a debt he meant to make right, and that memory, small as it was, tipped the room. Justice, when it came for Cornelius Vane, was not the dramatic ruin of storybooks. He did not go to prison, did not lose his bank in a single stroke, but it was justice all the same. The county court, presented with the authenticated deed and the corroborating ledger, ruled the land trust valid, and Cornelius Vane was made to relinquish the bottomland along the creek to the families named in his own father's hand, and made to pay, from his own considerable fortune, the back wages the ledger recorded, with interest accrued over 4 decades that very nearly emptied his coffers. He remained, afterward, a man of some means, but never again a man the town regarded without a shadow of doubt crossing its collective memory. And the families of the flats, within 2 years, had built homes on solid, dry ground with clean well water. Land that was, at last, honestly and legally their own. Della Mercer did not ask for a single dollar of the recovered wages, nor a single foot of the restored land, though the grateful families of the flats offered her both more than once. What she asked for, instead, once the dust of the court proceedings had settled, was permission to keep the old rail car exactly where it sat on the spur behind the depot, and with the small amount of goodwill and lumber the town now seemed eager to offer her. She turned it at last into what she had first imagined it might be. Back when $9 was all the hope she had left, a warm, well-swept room with a mended roof and an honest stove, where anyone in Larkspur Junction who needed a hot meal, a place to mend a coat, or simply a chair to sit in while the evening freight rolled through, was welcome without question. She hung, on the wall above where the false ceiling had once hidden its secret, the small carved wage token she had found first. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder, to herself and to anyone who asked about it, that the things a town discards are not always worthless, only unlooked at, and that patience, her father's old, unglamorous virtue, was, in the end, its own kind of arithmetic that always eventually balanced. It is worth remembering, now, that Della Mercer was cast out at 17 with $4, and no one willing to speak for her, and that 2 years later, with $11 and a foolish-seeming purchase, she found not a fortune for herself, but a debt 40 years overdue that an entire community had stopped believing would ever be paid. She never once used what she found to lift herself above the people who had once looked past her. She used it to lift them all together, which is, we think, the only kind of restoration that ever truly holds. The false ceiling of that old railcar had hidden more than papers. It had hidden the plain, stubborn truth that value does not vanish simply because the world stops looking for it. That a wrong does not become right simply because enough years pass over it in silence. Della's name is still spoken in Larkspur Junction, not as a woman who got lucky, but as the seamstress who read a room full of forgotten names aloud and would not stop reading until every one of them had been heard. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us and with Della's story. If it moved you even a little, we'd be so grateful if you'd hit follow or subscribe so you never miss the next story like hers. And if you have a moment, tell us in the comments, what is a time you found real value in something the rest of the world had already written off? We read every one, and we love hearing where your own stories lead. Until next time, stay close.